Okay, ownership and control of the mass media. We're on page 273. We'll be pleased to hear this is a lot shorter than the previous section. By the turn of the 20th century, educational reforms had created a newly literate mass market. The demand for new reading materials was met by the publication of most of the newspaper titles that are on the newsstands today, with many of their owners and publishers, such as Lord Beaverbrook at the Daily Express and Lord Rothermere at the Daily Mail, dominating the market for news in the United Kingdom throughout that century. With his successful purchase of The Sun in 1968, the Australian, now naturalised American Rupert Murdoch gained his first foothold in the British media, joining the ranks of the press barons, controlling the printed media before extending this hold across the globe. Okay, so here we have this term, press barons, which comes from the fact that they were lords and therefore, they had control over everything initially. But obviously it was your wealthier members of society who could afford to buy and control these different forms of the media. Okay, now Rupert Murdoch has spread his influence very rapidly. Alright, however, we did read in the previous section that this was controlled and is now has had limitations put on it, so that he can't just keep building and building, so that it's only his view that is expressed to everybody else. And with the research that you'll be asked to do, you will find out more about what has happened very recently in Rupert Murdoch's life. So Murdoch's media career has been of particular interest to sociologists and journalists alike. This is partly because of the speed with which he has gained such a large stake in the global media market, and partly because of his outspoken views and daring interventions in all dimensions of the media. Having inherited the Australian newspaper from his father, Murdoch went on to own The Sun, Times, Sunday Times and the News of the World in the United Kingdom. Now what's interesting in that is that those are the two diverse sides of the media in the UK. The Sun is perceived as a working class newspaper. The Times is considered to be an upper class broadsheet that people read for mental stimulation and to understand matters of big business. In the USA, he gained control of a series of publications before moving into broadcasting and satellite television stations. The box it's talking about here we will look at in class, because you're going to research some bits on it. These moves to global media control were mirrored by other companies such as Time Warner, so that large parts of the global media are now in the hands of a very few conglomerates. Okay, so large groups owning the predominance of the mass media. Okay, so therefore we have to question, what's the message that is being given to us by them? If this is only coming from a very small source, are they allowing other views to be brought in? Looking at the US as a whole, in the 1980s, according to Bagdikian, there were 50 dominant media corporations. By 1990, this had shrunk to 23 and only 10 by 1997, with every likelihood that this number will decrease again, to the point where a communications cartel can be described. The character as well as size of these organisations is also changing. It is now more common for companies not previously involved in the media to buy media organisations, general rather than communications conglomerates, such as the General Electric Company's purchase of NBC, one of the three largest coast-to-coast broadcasters in the USA. But you have to perceive this as the fact that these are successful companies and successful businesses. Therefore, people will think that they can actually make a lot of money from them. So they're not going to buy them so that they will then run them down. They're going to buy them to move forward. Now, this may mean that different viewpoints are put forward by the people that buy these groups. It may mean that they bring in experts themselves who will be able to help them make the most of these companies. So again, where do the ideologies and the viewpoints come from? The global trend towards increasing ownership and control of the mass media by a few very large companies is important to the mass manipulative approach, and makes the concept of a free press in a democratic society problematic. As others have argued, however, it is far from a decisive point in the debates between these leading perspectives on the mass media. Okay, so we talked about the mass manipulative model last time. Free press, on the other hand, is where the press are allowed to say and do whatever it is that they think is necessary. Now, you know, we talked before about exposés. So yes, the free press is going to criticise politicians and the way that they behave. Okay, but how free can the press be? You know, during war times, during World War I and World War II, not everything was released because we didn't want the enemy to get the information. Nowadays, we can see exactly on TV what's happening in what areas and almost what the strategies are of political groups and military manoeuvres. So is that a safe thing to have a free press? Should there be any control on it? So the BBC, for example, is not owned by any conglomerate but is part of the state in the United Kingdom, a parastatal organisation run by a government-appointed governing body, guardians of a state-determined charter and licence. These documents enshrine the BBC's commitment to report events objectively and impartially as a public service to its citizens. Whether they succeed in this aim is explored below. Okay, so whilst the BBC is not owned by a conglomerate, it is owned by the state. So do the state control what they do? But there is a charter within the BBC which says they will try to be objective and impartial. So in the past, party political broadcasts were actually only the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Then they allowed the Liberals, which became the Liberal Democrats. Okay, then they thought, well, actually there are other political groups, so they have to have a party political broadcast too. So, you know, gradually over time they have loosened up in various ways. So this is the pluralist perspectives. Pluralists focus on the dispersed and fragmented nature of mass media ownership, mirroring their view of power in society. As recently as 1983, that close, Turnstall could identify as many as 25 companies in competition for the British media market, with no one company dominant. Moreover, it is no longer the case that ownership of a company is the same as or involves the same individuals in control of a company. This is yet another dimension of the diverse and widespread nature of power within companies. Although these owners may have profit as their primary motive for involvement in the mass media, and must answer in the first instance to their own organisation and its shareholders, their influence, as well remarks, where it survives at all, must still defer to the influence of readers. In determining the content of the mass media, it remains the case that the consumer, rather than the owner, remains sovereign. In any case, television is the most popular medium, and the BBC, which is owned by no one, is the most frequently accessed outlet. The influence of the media barons, therefore, cannot be as great as is supposed. Okay, so this is the pluralistic perspective. As we've already seen, that they think there are lots of different views. These barons can't be as strong as Marxists are making out, okay? Particularly if the BBC is still the most popular medium for people to access TV programmes through. Marxist perspectives. For Marxists, there is a tendency towards monopoly in ownership and control of the mass media is unsurprising, as this tendency is part of the development of any capitalist society. The main debate within Marxism concerns the importance of the role of owners of the mass media in influencing its content. For structuralist Marxists, it follows axiomatically that in a capitalist society, the dominant ideology will be that of the ruling class, with the mass media as a central means of transmitting these ideas. The phenomenon of the separation of ownership from control, or the role played by specific media entrepreneurs, is unimportant, since proprietors and other capitalists do not need to intervene in newspaper production, since the logic of the prevailing market structure ensures that, by and large, the output endorses rather than opposes their general interests. Okay, so people don't have to be directly involved because they already have that control over what they are doing and the message that they're giving. No matter who owns the mass media in a capitalist society, the output of the mass media will reflect the ideology of the ruling class, with the implication that only a fundamental revolutionising of the ownership of the means of production can bring about a change in the ideological superstructure of which the mass media form a core part. Okay, so nothing's going to change it. The mass media is there, it's controlled by the ruling class, therefore their message is going to get across. A more instrumentalist approach, similar to the mass manipulative view, argues that the class background of media owners and their editorial interventions in their publications are important. It is because they are also members of the bourgeoisie that they use their media outlets to defend their class and play an important part in shaping the desires for consumer products, legitimating capitalism. This view of the mass media, which echoes much of the debate between Marxists concerning the role of the state, sees possibilities in challenging for alternative control of the media, in the belief that some small, partial change is possible, albeit temporarily. From the point of view of the hegemonic approach, ownership of the mass media is less important than the class character of the journalists and editors who produce its content. So whilst your journalists and editors continue to be upper class, that's the message that will get across. However, if you start having journalists who are middle class, lower class, then things may change, but it may only be temporary, because then the upper class will realise and take over again. Postmodernist perspectives. The issue of who owns or has financial control of the mass media is unimportant in understanding its impact. Attempts to look at the wider picture of the mass media structural location in society constitute a move towards constructing the very meta-narratives that postmodernists are critical of, attempting, for example, to find causal links between ownership and content. The only real issue is to identify the part played by the media and media technology in particular in creating the postmodern condition. Okay, so postmodernists are saying, look, it doesn't matter what the mass media may be trying to tell us, and if we then fall into that trap and create a story that it's controlled by the ruling class, we're putting labels onto things, and most postmodernists say that's not what we're supposed to do. How is the mass media helping to create the postmodern condition where everyone can make an individual decision for themselves based on what they choose to select from the mass media?